heavy steps of combat boots echoed down a long corridor as Tony was escorted by armed guards into a large concrete structure buried in the side of a mountain. His weapons had been confiscated upon his entrance into Canada. Tony had approached the border station, which appeared to be abandoned upon first inspection. He had only made it a few yards within the gate before a dozen rifles were trained on him. The guards had taken all of his possessions and forced him into a jeep. Tony had been blindfolded for what seemed like an hour before they allowed him to see the large entrance of the bunker. Tony could only wonder what their intentions were with him, and found himself wishing Colin was still alive to protect him. The procession stopped at a large iron door. One of the men pounded his fist on the entrance, causing it to reverberate against the concrete walls around them. Within seconds, a metallic clamor was heard from the other side, and the door opened. Another camouflaged man stood on the other side and directed Tony to enter. The boy was pointed to a small chair sat behind a large metal desk. Tony sat, his body almost shaking at the thought of what would come next. The door shut and was latched before the man sat across from Tony and opened a small folder that rested upon the desk. The man's pen clicked, and the folder was tossed open to what appeared to be some sort of form. "Name?" the man said. Tony jumped slightly, not expecting the voice. Tony. Full name, please," the voice changing to annoyance. "Anthony James Williams," Tony replied. "Age?" he asked. 11. 12 in November, the boy said as he looked around the room. "What is this place?" "Your questions will be answered later, but first we need to get some from you," the man said as he finally looked up to Tony. "So, where are you from?" Tony sighed, and for a moment he was not sure if he should be so honest. "Georgia." With every answer, the man scribbled on the form, and soon it was filled with most of Tony's personal information. The boy sat nervously, tapping his foot on the floor below him, the steady buzz of the fluorescent lights above him the only sound other than the questions. He found himself thinking of Colin again, wondering what his friend would have been doing in this situation. The boy imagined Colin fighting back against the guards at the border and finding a way to take them all down. He had built his recently departed friend into something superhuman, and the thought made him smile. The sound of the folder clapping closed broke him from his daydream. "Okay, that's enough of the boring stuff. It's time to get to the reason you are here," the man said with a smile playing on his lips. "This is Forward Base Charlie, and I am Bandit." Tony's eyebrows contorted at the name. "Bandit?" "Yep. When you start here, you get to change your name if you want. Most people have names like that around here. When we get you set up, you can choose one too. But I would think long and hard about it, because once you pick one, that's your name from here on out." Bandit's pen tapped on the folder as he spoke. "So, what is all this?" Tony's hands waved around him at the room. "Well, when the world went to shit, a lot of people didn't know what to do. Government went out the window, and most of the Army regulars weren't sure exactly what to do without the proper guidance. Some of them even lost their shit," Bandit said with a slight laugh in his tone. "So, it kind of left a hole that had to be filled. That's where we came in." "And who exactly are you?" Tony quizzed. "Well, our higher-ups are former military from various places. They came together to try and protect who was left, and have been recruiting every able-bodied person since. That's how I started. I mean, I was a snot-nosed kid from Oregon before I came here. Never used a gun in my life," Bandit laughed. "But who are you?" Tony's voice became annoyed at having to repeat himself. "Oh, sorry." Bandit paused. "Man, I have a tendency to ramble. I mean, they say I have a big mouth. I guess that's why they have me doing these little interviews for newbies." Tony simply shook his head before Bandit realized he still had not given the boy an answer. Okay. We call ourselves the Apex Predators." "That sounds really lame," Tony scoffed. Bandit shook his head. "Listen, I didn't make up the name. Some old fart did. Something about there are two kinds of people in this world, the predator and the prey. You know, wolf and sheep shit. They wanted to make sure we were the top of the top, you know?" Tony's eyes rolled a bit in his head. "Most of the guys I have seen so far don't look much older than me. And you're what? 15? The look on Bandit's face showed how insulted he seemed to be. 16, actually. Bandit finally escorted Tony from the tiny room and further down the hallway. They came to a large bay window with a desk just behind it. A young Hispanic girl sat at the desk with aisles of shelving behind her. Bandit passed the folder through a slot to the left of the window, and the girl retrieved it. As she skimmed Tony's form, she exchanged small talk with Bandit. Tony stood quietly, listening to the exchange, and learned that the girl's name was Pack Rat. It seemed fitting since she seemed to be the guardian of all of the supplies for the base. Tony's eyes scanned the shelves and saw stacks of clothing, food rations, weapons, ammunition, and various personal hygiene items. The girl finally turned her attention to Tony and began asking for his shirt, pants, and shoe sizes. Just as Bandit had taken his notes, so did Pack Rat. Every answer was scribbled into Tony's file, and once she was done, her little body disappeared among the stacks. When she returned, a pile of clothing was dropped into the slot by the window. Bandit pointed to it, and Tony only assumed he was to gather the things. The boy opened the metal slot and removed 3 tan shirts, 3 digital camouflage button-down shirts and matching pants. Once he closed the slot, Pack Rat dropped a pair of black combat boots into it and shoved it back through. Bandit opened the door, grabbed the boots, and plopped them on top of Tony's pile. Tony looked down into the boots and noticed they were filled with rolled-up balls that must have been his socks and underwear. "Okay, that's all you get for now," Bandit said. "That is, until we learn a little more about how capable you are." Tony was then escorted further into the compound, past a large set of double doors that approached a crosswalk within the hall. They took a left and approached another door. Through a small window at the top of it, Tony could tell that this was some sort of barracks. The other side held lines of bunk beds and young men scattered among them. Some lay on their racks reading. Some played cards over their footlockers. Some slept. And some of them were cleaning their rifles. The longer he looked, the more he realized that all of them seemed to be as young as he was. Bandit pulled open the door with one hand and waved Tony in with the other. "After you." The boy entered slowly, his stack of clothes almost covering his face. His eyes shifted from the faces before him, the faces that now turned to see him enter. It seemed like everything came to a stop to witness the newcomer, and this made Tony uncomfortable. His feet shuffled under him as Bandit entered just behind. The group sat in silence for a moment before Bandit introduced Tony to them and instructed the room to show the newbie around before turning on his heels and exiting the room. No one moved at first, especially Tony. The world he had come to know recently had taught him to be cautious, and at the moment he felt like he was standing in front of a T-Rex, trying to be as still as possible so that he would not get attacked. Tony wanted to be invisible. He wanted to crawl into a hole away from the constant stare of every boy in the room. That's when a hand clapped down on his shoulder, causing him to jump and turn toward it. A dark-haired Caucasian boy laughed for a moment before removing his hand. "Sorry about that," he spoke through a slight laugh. "I forgot how jumpy I was when I first got here." "Haha, yeah," Tony faked a laugh. The dark-haired boy shoved an open hand forward. "Name's Duke." "Hey." Tony reached out and shook the inviting hand. "Duke, huh?" Duke gave a weak chuckle, rubbing at his close-shaved hair. "Yeah, I didn't pick it. Some of the guys did. They said it's 'cause I sound like one of them Duke boys, you know, from that old show." Tony shook his head. "Never seen it." "Ah, guess you won't get the reference then. Anyway, let me show you around," Duke said, as he started down the path between the rows of beds. As Duke passed by groups of people, he named off people. There was Skinny, who was, of course, a very skinny Middle Eastern boy. Then there was Tex, who was not from Texas but somehow was roped with the name. He met a Hot Rod, Flex, Rabbit, Joker, Fox, Bug, Wolf, and a Mac, which was short for Mack Truck because of his size. All of these names had corresponding meanings and applied to the personality that held them. Tony began to understand the reason for the name-choosing tradition. They all seemed visibly happy to be someone different from who they had once been. It was like starting over and prying themselves up from whatever hell they had come from. That was when Tony began thinking of what he would want his new name to be. That thought rushed through him as the tour continued, and he missed the next group of names. He did not snap out of it until they approached the bathroom. "Now this room has your showers and shitters," Duke said. "We have 2 bathroom rules. 1, if it's yellow, you let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. We have to conserve water." Tony laughed at the thought as Duke continued. 2, we get showers on Monday and Thursday, that's it. Again, to conserve water. "I'm used to going without showers, so that's no big deal," Tony replied. "Yeah, we all were too when we got here." Duke scratched at his head again as he looked down. "So, how long were you out there anyway?" Tony's eyes trailed off, thinking of the last year of his life and Colin. "I was alone for the first month or so after the fall, but I had company over the last year. He just didn't make it here." Duke shook his head as he looked up. "Sorry. It's okay. We almost made it. Some asshole tried to jack us just outside the border and my friends stopped him, but got shot in the process." Tony kicked at the concrete as he spoke. "Man, that really sucks," Duke replied. "But you made it here and we take care of each other." Tony felt Duke's hand slap him on the back, and something about it made him feel better. He even gave a little laugh at the thought of feeling safe again. He had wondered if he would be after losing Colin, but the people here did not seem too bad. Duke showed him to an empty bed that he could use. Tony placed his clothing in the footlocker at the end of it, and unrolled the folded sheets and pillowcase. He prepped his bed just before Bandit returned to the door. He called out to the room, "Lights out. We got an early day tomorrow, ladies." And the flickering fluorescent lights above them went dark. The room was woken by a blaring trumpet. A very large man stood at the doorway, while a young man blared the instrument. As the horn fell silent, the man instructed them to get on their gear and meet in the training area. Tony rushed to pull on his clothing as some of the other boys disappeared out the doors. He did not want to be left behind because he had no idea where the training area was. While he struggled to tie his boots, Duke stepped over to him and helped him finish. Duke stayed until Tony was finished and told him that he would not let him get lost on his first day. Tony thanked him, and something about the way Duke cared reminded him of Colin, which made him sad. He tried to hide the feeling and forced a smile as they exited the barracks. When they exited a doorway at the rear of the hall, Tony was greeted by a large clearing that was surrounded by a concrete wall on all sides. His eyes scanned the enclosure in the dim daybreak, guessing that the wall had to be at least 20 feet high. The area was as large as a football field and was littered with ropes, ladders, ramps, tires, and metal bars. Tony knew what this was. It was an obstacle course. The boys lined up in rows of 6, and Tony fell in line next to Duke. His new friend pointed to the man that had woken them all up, as if to tell him to pay attention. For those of you who do not already know me, I am Sergeant Buzzkill. The man's voice sounded like thunder, but you will call me Sir. Understood? The group screamed in unison. Yes, sir. Tony jumped at the sound as the sergeant spoke again. I'm sorry, I thought I asked you a question. The boys screamed again, and this time Tony joined them. Yes, sir. The sergeant paced back and forth across the front line, but his eyes caught sight of Tony, who stood in the back. The man's broad shoulders pushed past the boys between them and came to stand over Tony. His eyes were intense, the kind of stare that you only developed from combat. He stood silent for a moment, weighing in his thoughts of the new recruit. Tony's mind swam with worry, unsure of what might happen next. Tony's eyes shifted slightly over to Duke, and at that second the sergeant spoke directly to him. Don't look at him, look at me. Buzzkill's voice boomed again, and Tony could feel his spit splash his face. Tony stiffened, his eyes wide. Yes, sir. What's your name, kid? The man barked. Tony stammered. Spit it out, punk, the sergeant said. Tony. The boy forced it out. The sergeant huffed, a smile curling on his lips. No. What's your real name, boy? Tony had not decided on a name yet, so he scrambled for an answer. He was quiet for several moments, running through the options he had been contemplating. His eyes shifted slightly, and he noticed the people in front of him were watching intently for his answer. The sergeant seemed to lean in closer, his smile widening at the idea of causing Tony distress. Suddenly, the boy did not want to be here. He wanted to be back in the cabin with Colin. He wanted to go back and start over. Fear crept up in him, a fear he thought he had escaped. All of this swarmed his mind as the sergeant waited for an answer. Well, the man bellowed. Tony's mouth opened without thinking. Stone? The sergeant leaned back and let out a hearty laugh. Stone. More like pebble. All of the boys joined in the laughter, all of them except Duke, but they were silenced quickly by a raised hand from the sergeant before he spoke again. Very well, Stone. The sergeant turned on one heel and returned to the front of the group. Tony felt Duke's elbow nudge him, and when he turned toward his friend, there was a grin spread across his face. Tony had chosen a name, which he could not change. From that moment forward, he would be known as Stone by everyone within the base. The day started with calisthenics as a warm-up. Then they hit the course, and though Tony had been worried about the task, he seemed to have no trouble with the challenge. His year with Colin in the emptiness had not only taught him a lot, but it had prepared his body for the future. That thought pushed him harder. Tony wanted to live up to Colin's memory. As Tony crossed the finish line before anyone else, one thing echoed within his mind, and that was his promise to survive. Through his gasps for breath, he was still able to smile, and he imagined Colin smiling back. "What are you smiling for, Stone?" the sergeant yelled. Tony was broke from his dream again. "I'm alive, sir." "For now," Buzzkill responded, a sense of seriousness in his voice. Tony's smile faded as the rest of the boys joined him at the end of the obstacle course. They all struggled to breathe, some hunched over and holding their knees. They all poured sweat and begged for rest. Tony could only imagine how tired everyone else was, but his muscles burned from the strain. Duke patted him on the back and congratulated him on finishing first. Tony feigned a smile again, unable to shake the sergeant's words. He knew how dangerous the world was, but the illusion of this place had allowed him to forget for a short time. The boy knew he would have to leave these walls eventually, and he was sure that was what his instructor meant. The young men spent the winter training, Tony finding himself outshining most of his squad mates. While most of them had come from backgrounds with survival knowledge, Tony had lived it during his year with Colin. His sergeant soon requested that Tony become their training squad leader and would be tasked with carrying out their daily routine. When the announcement was made, Tony could feel the daggers dig into him from some of the older boys within the group. He knew his promotion would stir bad feelings, but there was little he could do about it. Tony had made a promise, and he would do whatever it took to survive. After one particularly grueling day of traversing the course through harsh winter conditions, the boys took to their bunks groaning in pain. When Tony's head hit the pillow, his exhaustion brought him to slumber far quicker than it ever had. The grumbles and complaints around him had become common, but it faded as visions of the warm waters of a lake filtered into his mind. He saw Colin standing on a bank as Tony swam, the summer sun warming their bodies. A smile crept across Tony's lips during his sleep, until the sun was eclipsed by darkness. He began to gasp, unable to breathe, and slipped under the water. Tony woke to his blanket being forced down on both sides by multiple boys. He quickly struggled to free himself, but their combined strength was too much to protest. Tony screamed into the sock that had been shoved into his mouth, begging for help. Soon a slurry of fists buried into his abdomen. He was struck repeatedly for several minutes within the dark room of their barracks. Each of them had blacked out their faces to avoid identification, but it did not matter. Tony knew who was attacking him and why. The commotion stirred Duke from his bed. He scrambled from his bunk and across another. When he reached the group, his body dove shoulder first into one of the boys holding down Tony. Another released his hold on the blanket to face Duke, slinging a fist in that direction. Duke quickly evaded, grasping hold of the arm as it passed and tossed the boy to the side. As Duke tried to right himself from the maneuver, another punch landed firm in his jaw, sending him to the floor. This had left one side of Tony's bed partially free, giving the squad leader the ability to free himself with squirms and kicks until his body slid from his bunk. Duke struggled to his feet, the other boys rounding the bed. Tony dropped his heel into one of their knees, which caused it to buckle. Soon Duke and Tony were back to back, surrounded by the remaining boys. They both bore their fists and prepared to fight as the ones on the floor regained their stance. Tony landed a right hook in one of the boys' ribs, while Duke's knee buried in one's gut. Their attack left him open, and they soon felt knuckles bury themselves in their faces. They stumbled, but came to rest against each other's backs for support. The two advanced again, ready to strike, But just before they could land a hit, the fluorescent lights flicked to life above them, and their sergeant's voice echoed through the hall. "What in the hell is going on in here?" Buzzkill's voice boomed. All of the boys stood like statues, Tony and Duke turning to face their instructor. "Squad leader Stone?" The sergeant's eyes cutting to Tony. The group looked to Tony, his face bruised from the altercation. It was easy to see what had transpired, and all of them knew the consequences of their actions. Several boys shuffled their feet behind Tony, preparing nervously for their punishment. Tony had no reason to defend them, but he also knew that if they were punished for fighting, then so would he and Duke. It only took him a few seconds to make his decision. He stood at attention, steadying himself, and clear his throat. "Everything is fine, sir. Just a sparring session," Tony lied. "Well, it's over now. It's lights out. Clean yourself up and get to bed," Buzzkill barked. All of the boys quickly made their way back to their bunks. Tony stood at attention until all of his men were back in bed, staring at the sergeant. Buzzkill gave the boy a slight nod, knowing what he had done for his fellow squad mates, before turning and leaving the room. When the lights went out again, Tony slid back into his bed and pulled his blanket up over his aching body. Every muscle screamed at him in pain, but he would not let it show. There were whispers around the room as he closed his eyes and tried to return to his dream, despite how much he hurt. When they were roused by the morning bugle, each boy made their bed, dressed for the day, and stood at attention at the end of their bunk. Tony stood at the end of the aisle, counting them off as each member of his squad took their place. His eyes fell on 6 empty bunks. Tony stared at them, noticing the neatly made bed. His trance was broken by the sound of Sergeant Buzzkill announcing their orders for the day. They would be participating in a live fire exercise, and they were to report to the indoor firing range. Tony turned on his heel and ordered his men to follow him. They marched down the hall, their instructor walking in tandem with Tony. "Permission to speak, sir," Tony requested. "Go ahead, Stone." Buzzkill's voice barely above a whisper. "Where are my men?" the boy questioned. "They are not your men anymore. We don't need soldiers like that here," the man answered. The group entered the indoor range and took a place at each position. Tony knelt and retrieved his issued AR-15, readying it for use. Buzzkill stood at the end of the line, hand resting on a lever. When it was pulled, their targets would drop from the ceiling. They were instructed to ready themselves, release the safety, and prepare to fire. Tony took his stance and adjusted his breathing, his finger preparing to reach for the trigger. Buzzkill dropped the level, the opening in the ceiling parting, and 6 large figures hanging from ropes with their heads covered in black bags. Tony's eyes shot open at the sight, his hand loosening its grip on the rifle. None of the boys fired a shot, but stared at the targets in front of them with nooses around their neck. "Fire!" Buzzkill yelled. "Sir?" Tony questioned. "I said fire," he repeated. "No, stand down," Tony replied, looking back to his men. "Excuse me, Stone? What did you just say?" Buzzkill's eyes grew wide and the veins in his face grew close to bursting. Tony had been used to firing at training dummies and sandbags, but this was wrong. Each boy clicked the safety on their rifle and held it at an angle while coming to attention. Tony did the same, his face showing the seriousness of his choice. The boys hanging from the ceiling were already dead. Tony knew this and saw no sense in defiling their corpses, and these boys did not deserve this. The squad leader stared at the instructor, his eyes curled in anger. "Stone, You do understand that if you or your men don't fire on those targets, then it will be you that pays the price? The sergeant quizzed. Yes, sir. Tony's voice echoed through the firing range. Very well. The rest of you return to your barracks. Stone, you come with me. Buzzkill disarmed the boy as the rest of the squad exited the room, his heavy hand coming to rest on Tony's shoulder. Follow me, boy. Tony took one last look back as Duke exited, a sense of worry playing on his friend's face. Tony simply nodded, telling Duke that everything would be all right, even though he did not believe it himself. He simply turned and was escorted out the other exit and down the hallway. They came to a stop at a door with 2 armed guards. Buzzkill handed the AR-15 to one of the men before the other opened the door. Tony was guided inside by the rough hand of his instructor. He was placed at a small desk, one like you might see in a classroom. The instructor took a seat across the room in one of many chairs that lined the wall. The door opened again. Several uniformed men entered in a single file. They each took a seat across the room, and as Tony watched, the sergeant rose and held a salute until each one was seated. Their uniforms were more intricate than the one Tony had been given, and each were adorned with a patch that signified they were actual apex predator forces. When the sergeant's hand dropped from his greeting, he called for his folder. One of the guards entered holding a file that looked strikingly like the one filled with Tony's information. The folder was then handed to the man at the front of the line, and he flicked it open to begin scanning the contents. So, this is the one you have been bragging about, Sergeant? The man spoke behind shadows. Yes, sir. I think he has what it takes, Buzzkill responded. The man passed the folder down as he finished reading. You think? Or you know? I know, sir. Buzzkill quickly corrected himself. The man stood slowly, approaching the light. When the dim glow illuminated the man's face, Tony could finally place it with the voice. He had a terribly scarred appearance, and one of his eyes seemed glassy and whiter than should be natural. Tony could only assume this man had no vision within that eye. The close-cropped hair and build suggested this person had seen true combat in his life, and Tony could only wonder what they wanted with him. My name is General Foreman. The sound was deep and almost rang in Tony's ears. Who are you, kid? T2. The boy almost slipped. Stone, sir. The group laughed. Stone? You look like a pebble to me. Tony tried to keep from rolling his eyes as the general spoke. So, you want to be a predator, huh? Tony was confused. He had never expressed any interest in combat. I just want to survive, sir. I made a promise to survive. A promise, huh? To who? The general smirked. Tony thought back to Colin. A friend and I intend on keep it no matter what. Foreman turned back to the rest of the men, who seemed to be officers as well. They spoke in hushed tones for several minutes, deliberating over some decision that still confused the boy. Each one slowly nodded as if placing their vote, while Tony sat unsure of what he would be asked to do next. His sergeant looked back and nodded as if to assure him that everything was fine. But this man had just asked him to shoot the dead body of a helpless boy. He was not sure if he could trust any of them at this point. Tony tried to think of what Colin would do, but before he could find an answer, the general was standing over him again. Okay, Private Stone, we are going to see if you have what it takes. Foreman smiled. The officers exited the room, just as they had entered, and Tony was left with the sergeant again. The folder was placed on the desk in front of the boy, as he was given a detailed description of what would happen next. Tony would be taken. along with any other recruit that had been accepted to the next phase of training. Any of those who did not make the cut would be given other duties to attend to. That was when Tony questioned the sergeant regarding the 6 boys that had been murdered. The sergeant laughed. "They aren't dead, kid. Just relocated. Those bodies were of enemies. They died in combat." "What?" The boy struggled to understand. "It was a test to see if you would shoot or act on your better instincts," Buzzkill smirked. "And you passed." Tony almost sighed in relief, completely surprised by this revelation. He was sure he had wandered into a camp full of psychopaths that had murder on their mind. The boy was escorted back to the equipment room, where Packrat was instructed to return all of Tony's personal belongings they had confiscated on his arrival. She returned soon after with the olive green pack that he had taken from Colin. A tear almost formed in the corner of his eye at the sight, but he pushed it back with his hand. He took the bag and was escorted to an area of the compound he had never been to, another barracks full of young men. The young man scanned the room. He only noticed 2 familiar faces and could only assume the rest had been reassigned. His heart sunk a little when he did not see Duke, but he hoped it was for the best. Tony was not even sure he wanted to be a member of this group, but it did not seem he had much choice. He could only hope he would be safer with soldiers around him. An older boy who seemed to be at least 17 approached him. The boy had dark, scraggly hair that hung about his ears and down to his shoulders. Some of his locks were tied back behind his head, enough to keep it out of his face. His skin was dark and heavily tanned by the sun. "The name's Apache." His hand stuck out quickly for a shake. "Stone," Tony replied. "Welcome to B Company, Stone. Let me show you your bunk," Apache said before guiding Tony to his bed. "Get settled. Chow is in 30 minutes, and we have a hike after that." Tony sat on his bed, removing his belongings from the bag and placing them in his footlocker. The trunk already had a week's worth of uniforms and toiletries inside. The clothing was all the right size, and his name, Stone, was labeled on the end of the bed. His place had been reserved within the few minutes it took to arrive. This place was rather efficient, Tony thought. As he squared everything away and closed his locker, the door to the room opened again. Tony did not look up but noticed that the footlocker across from him read, Duke. Duke and Tony were only a year apart, so that coupled with their previous training in the same group, placed them as partners. Each partnership was responsible for each other during training and missions. What missions they would be partaking in, Tony was unsure, but he was glad to have Duke watching his back. It was the first time he felt he could truly trust someone since losing Colin. The next year would be spent training much as any other soldier. The only difference was they had to prepare for the world they now lived in and learn how to combat it. Once their superiors were sure they could handle themselves in the field, a training exercise was implemented to test it. The pairs were sent outside the walls with a specific task in mind. Tony and Duke set off in the night, shivering in the cold. They had minimal gear, and each carried a rifle. They watched as the other group split off and went different directions. Once the two of them were alone on the snowy path, Duke began to make idle conversation. Tony answered as best as he could, his mind thinking back to the last time he was outside the base. His eyes constantly scanned the area around them. All he could think of was being attacked, his mind returning to the day Colin died. "You okay?" Duke asked. "Yeah, just not sure if I'm ready for this," Tony replied. "Well, that's what we are out here to find out," Duke said as he nudged his partner. Maybe. Or maybe we are being fed to the wolves, Tony said with a sigh. The pair stopped and knelt down near their destination. They laid unmoving under snow-covered brush, their eyes trained on a large moving truck in the distance. 3 men stood outside an old barn, smoking and chatting with one another. Their mission was to retrieve that truck by any means necessary. Duke tapped Tony on the shoulder, then pointed toward the tree line on the western side. Tony simply nodded as they crept from their hiding place toward the trees. The 2 boys kept low and moved from tree to tree, their camouflage in the darkness hiding their movements until they were close. They paused at the edge of the trees, watching the men until they returned inside. Duke made a break for the driver's door, and Tony headed for the opposite side. The 2 eased the doors open and gently pressed them closed. Duke's hands ran across the dash behind the steering wheel, feeling the hard metal of the keys still in the ignition. He gave one more look to Tony as if questioning if he was ready. Tony nodded again as the truck roared to life. The truck had only moved a few feet when the barn door opened and the men came running out, firing their rifles at the sides of the truck. The 2 boys ducked slightly to avoid a ricocheting bullet, and Duke's foot pressed the pedal to the floor. They were out of sight within minutes and laughing to each other of their success. 2 miles down the road, Duke pulled the truck into a small clearing in the woods. They would need to check the contents of the truck before returning home. Tony jumped down from the passenger seat and met his partner at the back door. The metal creaked and moaned as the latch dropped and the door began to open. Duke stumbled back for a moment, bumping into Tony as 4 teenagers stepped from the cargo area, aiming their rifles at the 2 boys. Tony's head turned to the ground in disappointment, and Duke simply shook his head in disbelief. "Looks like you boys failed," Apache said, smiling. "Only because we got bad intel," Tony scoffed. "Yeah. Plus the 2 groups aren't supposed to be working together, just partners," Duke reprimanded. "You think there are rules out there?" Weasel mocked. "I think I know where you got your name from now," Tony popped back. "Watch it, kid," Weasel replied as Tech laughed in the background. "Okay," Apache broke up the argument. "Let's get back to the base before it gets too late. Wheeler, get this thing moving." With a quick acknowledgement of his orders, one of the larger boys jumped from the cargo area and climbed into the driver's seat. Duke and Tony approached the truck, but were informed that their punishment for failing the mission was a walk home. Duke glared at Apache, the thought of a 6-mile hike back to base in the snow making him furious. Tony simply tapped him on the shoulder and shook his head, knowing it was useless to argue. The truck sprang to life again, and soon it was so far away they could not even hear it. The 2 boys began walking, their eyes scanning the trees around them in the darkness. After about an hour of walking, Tony tapped Duke on the shoulder. He had noticed the lights first, but as soon as Duke's eyes fell on them, they both dropped to a crouch and crept to the trees. The moving truck sat unmoving on the side of the road, but the area around it was still lit by the headlights. They sat watching for a few minutes, scanning the area, but saw no movement. If the truck had been overtaken by an opposing force, they would have surely taken it. The scene just did not make sense. Duke raised a finger to his mouth, signaling for Tony to be quiet, then waved for him to follow. The 2 moved slowly through the trees toward the truck. Tony slid his rifle from his shoulder, his eyes intent on the truck. Duke soon did the same, readying for whatever they may encounter ahead. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of their squad mates nearby. Tony eased his way to the back door, which was still unlatched. One hand pushed the door open, while the other pushed the barrel of the rifle into it. It too was empty, but something inside did catch his eye. A dark brown stain in the middle of the floor. Duke rounded the passenger side of the truck to find Tony staring into the empty truck. It took a second for Duke to look at the spot, but as soon as he did, his hand grasped onto Tony's arm and began pulling him back to the trees for cover. The two sat listening to wind push the canopy about above them. The faint sound of laughter began to filter in among the still of the night, and Duke turned to the direction it appeared to emanate. Instinctively, they began moving toward the sound, purposefully avoiding any twigs or brush that might signal their approach. The crackling of a fire could be heard now, and the voices were more audible. There appeared to be 4 separate male voices having a conversation. Duke noticed the trees began to thin, which meant they were approaching a clearing. The light from the fire became visible, and the shadows of the men danced through the grass. "I really wish you hadn't killed the long-haired one," one man spoke. "He was pretty. I could have had some fun with him." "We'd still have that little girl if you weren't so rough with her," another replied. "Both of you shut up. You're giving me a headache," a third broke in. "You could be helping me clean this meat so we can eat." Those words caused Tony to step back a moment, but Duke urged him forward. They both needed to see what was ahead, even if they did not want to. When the group ahead came into view, they could see one man poking at the fire with a stick, another rummaging through the packs on the ground, and 2 standing over the shredded body of Apache. Tony covered his mouth as vomit tried to roll up his throat. Duke put his finger to his lips again, begging Tony to be quiet. The other 3 boys had been bound together and gagged at the edge of the makeshift campsite. They all were beaten and bruised, fear apparent in their eyes. "We've got to do something," Tony whispered. "I know. Just give me a minute to think." Duke tried to be quiet as well. "There is too many of them for us to take, so we're going to have to split them up." "Let me go around. Get their attention," Tony suggested. "You go get our friends." "No. If they catch you, then I am alone." Duke shook his head as he spoke. "I'm going to try and pull the one by the bag out. Get your knife ready." Duke crept through the trees, Tony following behind. They reached the back of the tree near the pile of bags the man was steadily pulling items out of. Tony pressed his back to it, pulling his combat knife from its sheath. He nodded to Duke just before his friend leaned down and picked up a rock. Duke leaned to the side and whipped the rock at the man, landing it against his leg. The man jumped and looked out into the darkness where the rock had come from. The man pulled a knife of his own and began easing toward the tree. As he rounded it, he saw Duke standing about 10 feet inside the trees and gave a sick smile. As the man stepped past the tree, he began licking at the blade of his knife. He urged Duke to come to him while laughing to himself. Before he noticed the motion, Tony had leapt onto his back, cupping a hand over the man's mouth, and slid his blade across his throat. Blood gurgled from the wound, mixing with the man's attempt to scream. The sound was muffled by Tony's hand, but the man began to struggle. Duke approached and restrained their prey and forced him to the ground. They stood over him, keeping his cries quiet until he finally fell still. Tony leaned back against the tree, staring down at the blood on his knife and hands. "Okay, now we just have to split off another one," Duke said as he leaned around the tree. When Tony didn't respond, his friend looked back. "Stone, you with me?" Tony just stared at his hands, causing Duke to grip onto his shoulders. "You gotta stay with me, Stone. I can't take these guys on my own." Duke could tell Tony was afraid. He could feel the boy's body quivering under his hands. "You did what you had to do. They killed Apache, and they are going to kill all of us if you don't help me stop them." Tony snapped back to the reality he was now facing. The seriousness of the situation had become a weight on his shoulders, but he knew Duke was right, just like Colin had always been right. There were some times when you had to kill to stay alive. He started moving before being told to, his body weaving between trees as they circled the camp. He felt like one of the wolves that had attacked his cabin so long ago. They stalked their prey in the dark, working their way closer and closer. He started to understand why they were called apex predators. They hunted the hunters. "Where did Jeb go?" one of the men quizzed. "I don't know, Bill. Probably went to take a piss," another said. "Well, he didn't take his gun, so go check on him," Bill ordered. The smallest of the group stepped out into the brush, grumbling about having to chase after Jeb and carrying one of the rifles that they had pulled from one of the boys. His feet shuffled through the brush, calling out for his friend and scanning the area. The light from the fire began to dim as he rounded a tree and tripped over something solid. He landed with a thud and his rifle tumbled away from him. He cursed out in pain, having landed on a rock. He slowly rose from the ground, brushing dirt from his pants. "What happened, Rick?" Bill called from the fire. "Nothing, just tripped over a root or something," Rick responded. "Well, get Jeb and get your ass back here," Bill yelled. Yeah, Rick mumbled as he wiped at his pants again. His hands touched something wet, and when he raised it to his face, he noticed the red tint. His eyes widened as he turned to look at the body of Jeb crumpled up by the tree. He turned to scream for help, but just as he did, 2 shots rang out from the campsite. He quickly picked up his rifle and rushed back to the fire to find both of the remaining men lying in pools of their own blood, bullet holes in their skulls. His eyes searched the trees, but he saw nothing. He turned back toward Jeb's body to see Duke aiming at him. "Put the gun down," Duke said. "Yeah, right, kid." Rick lifted his gun as well. "Do what he says." Tony's voice broke as he pressed the barrel of his AR-15 against the man's head. They disarmed the man and bound him with the same restraints that had held their friends. Duke instructed 2 of the boys to gather material and make a gurney so they could bring Apache's body back to the base. Tony told Wheeler to head back to the road and make sure the truck was still there. Once they had gathered their things, along with their prisoner, they marched back to the road and loaded Apache into the truck. The group rode in silence, keeping their guns trained on Rick, who sat gagged in the back of the truck. When the group pulled up at the base, they quietly unloaded. Their instructor came to check on the results of the exercise and noticed the ravaged body of one of his trainees. He began to question the group when Tony and Duke exited the truck with their prisoner in tow. They shoved him toward the instructor, indicating his crimes as they passed. They were tired, hurt, and covered in dirt and blood. All they wanted to do was to bury Apache, but their superiors had a different plan. The body was confiscated for evidence and Rick was placed in a holding cell. The following day, the entire group were called to speak to General Foreman, one at a time. They were questioned about the events of the previous night and told not to repeat them to another soldier. Tony and Duke sat outside the office waiting their turn, unsure of what they would be asked. Duke considered asking Tony if he was going to be all right, but the blank stare that still hung on the boy's face made him second-guess it. Tony sat emotionless while Duke disappeared into the general's office. He sat thinking of the blood on Apache's body. Then he thought about how it felt to kill again. It reminded him of Colin and how small it made him feel. His name being called broke him from his dream as Duke passed by him without looking at him. "Speckless Stone," Foreman said as Tony took a seat. "I'm sure you know why you are here." "Yes, sir," the boy answered, staring at the wall behind the man. "What happened?" Foreman asked, while scribbling notes and staring at his papers. Tony relayed the story for the general, his eyes not leaving the whitewashed wall, barely even blinking. The words told each step he had made and what he had witnessed. It played on repeat in his head as he spoke, his body shaking when he began detailing Apache's body. Then when mentioned killing, he would look to his hands. They still felt dirty. In his mind, he could still see the blood staining it. When he was finished, he sat staring at his hands, and the general finished writing to notice. The room was quiet for some time, neither of them sure what to say at first. "Why?" Tony mumbled. "We call them vultures. It's one of the things we are fighting against out there." Foreman sighed. "How did they even know we would be out there?" Tony's eyes became wild and turned directly at the general. Foreman turned in his chair, stood and walked around the desk. He sat on the edge of it, and for a moment, just looked at Tony. He shook his head for a moment, trying to decide what to say. There were a lot of things in this world that had changed, but he was still having trouble understanding it himself. When he was sure of the right words and how to say them, he gave another sigh and slid the folder across the desk. Tony looked down to see images of two men in apex predator uniforms, one of which looked familiar. He looked closer, and his eyes grew wide, remembering the man who was carving into Apache. "We have found that some of those vultures have found their way into our ranks," Foreman said with a frown. You mean?" Tony shook his head. "No, not in here too." "Not anymore. You took care of that." Foreman rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. Tony pulled away. "How do you know there isn't more?" The general stood and went back to his seat, pulled the folder back to him and said, "That's why I asked you here, Stone." It took the next year for their small unit to uncover the wolves among them, but with the general's help they did. There had been 6 charged with molestation, 4 for rape, and 3 more groups killing their younger counterparts. They only found 1 more instance of cannibalism, but it was enough. With each mission, Tony became harder. He was becoming the wolf that stalked in the night, and his pack grew strong. At the end of that year, each member of their group was promoted to corporal, and B Company had been nicknamed the Night Stalkers. Where their individual strength was lacking, they made up for with teamwork. No one dared cross them in packs, and it was not long before they received their first mission outside their usual scouting grounds. They would be sent south, back across the border. Tony would be going back to Pembina, North Dakota, for the first time in over 2 years, and he immediately thought of a tiny inscription over a shallow grave. Like usual, the group set out at night. Buzzkill had been requested to drive them by jeep to the border, where they set out on foot. They moved quietly through the overgrown field, the brush higher than their crouched bodies. The moon overhead guided their movements as they approached a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Pembina. Tony recognized the place. He had passed it not long before being taken by the predators. His eyes scanned the field, especially further south. There stood the decrepit tree, a monument to his past. He tapped Duke on the shoulder and pointed to it, signaling to head that way. The group came to rest under the tree, several of the boys taking an opportunity to check their gear, grab a gulp of water, or check their map. Duke hovered over one of them, staring down at the map and asking questions of the designated target. Tony stood by the tree, running his fingers along Colin's name. It took a few minutes for Duke to notice, but he approached and placed a hand on Tony's shoulder. "You okay?" Duke asked, his brows curving in concern. "Yeah, just saying hello to an old friend." Tony smiled slightly. "What?" the older of the two said, confused. "Remember I told you I had help getting all the way here?" Tony replied. "Well, yeah, that's about all you ever really told me." "This is where he died." Tony waved his hands around to the clearing. "So, this is where I buried him." "Oh." Duke shuffled his feet and looked down before coming closer, noticing the name in the tree. "Colin?" "Yeah, he was like a brother to me. I would not have made it here if it were not for him." Tony sighed, a tear forming at the edge of his eye. "Funny." Duke laughed slightly. "Why's that?" Tony turned to look at him. "I had a brother named Colin," Duke said while smiling, his eyes trailing off in a memory. Tony found himself staring at Duke, shocked by what he had heard. What were the odds? He stared harder, and soon Duke noticed. Duke squinted again, asking if his friend was okay. Tony simply knelt down and removed his pack. A small compartment on the side was opened, and Tony revealed a tattered old Bible. Between the pages he found what he was looking for, a yellowed and worn picture of a family. There was a mother, father, and two very young boys. He tucked the Bible under his arm and stepped to Duke, handing him the picture. Duke's eyes narrowed as he attempted to see the image in the dark, but soon he realized what he was looking at. His thumb trailed over the young image of his mother and the smiling face of his father. He laughed slightly at seeing his chubby cheeks as a tiny boy, and when he saw Colin, the tears began to roll down his cheeks. Tony brushed a tear away as well, seeing this, and stepped back to the tree. He knelt there over Colin's grave, holding the Bible and looking at Duke. "How?" Duke said. "I have no idea. He thought you were dead," Tony said in a quiet tone of remembrance. "So he's buried here?" Duke asked. Tony nodded. "Right under your feet. He died protecting me, and I couldn't just leave him out here to be picked at by the animals. He wouldn't do that to me." Duke knelt by the makeshift grave, his hand touching the ground. Salty specks littered the dirt as they both sat quietly. The rest of the group had noticed the exchange, but decided to stay out of it. Tony then leaned over, pushing the Bible toward Duke. He told him it had been Colin's, and he knew that his brother would want him to have it. Duke took the worn book from Tony, his fingers pressing it open and scanning through the pages. The ink was faded, but he could still read some of the scriptures. The front still had his brother's name written in it, and he remembered when his grandmother had gifted them both one. Duke's hands flipped to the back pages, which had been left blank for writing notes. He found a letter addressed to him in his brother's handwriting. "Danny, if I don't see you again and you're reading this, I am sorry I could not protect you better. I spent the last few months so sure you were dead. Then I found Tony. He gave me hope to find you again. He has become like a brother to me. He reminds me so much of you. He could never replace you, but it made it easier out here without you. If you find him with this book, stay close to him. He can't replace me either, but you won't regret meeting him. Take care of each other. Survive and remember, I will always love you. Your big brother, Colin. Duke tucked the Bible in his pack and gave Tony a hug. Their group turned away and Weasel started asking about the mission to try to change the subject. Tony stepped away, patting Duke on the back. He nodded to him to say it would be all right, and promised they could talk more once the mission was done. Duke agreed, and they stepped back to the group. Weasel had pointed out the path they would take that lead to the farmhouse ahead. It sat just on the edge of the property, and according to their sources, a group of murderous scavengers had taken up residence in it. According to General Foreman, this is where most of the vultures had come from recently. The radio keyed up. A message came through from Overwatch Group, requesting position of the Night Stalkers. Tony touched at his ear, before identifying himself and informing them of their position. They were asked for confirmation of go status. Tony looked to the group who nodded in agreement. Tony gave the confirmation as they all readied their weapons. The group moved toward the farmhouse as a larger group waited on the hill behind the house. Overwatch was made up of a more experienced adult group, which had been instructed to observe and assist. This was their first sanctioned mission outside the wall, and would determine their future within the apex predators. Tech observed from the back with binoculars, calling out targets appearing through the windows. There had been 2 armed men standing on the front porch, 3 inside that appeared to be drinking an unidentified motion within one of the upstairs windows. The group advanced. Duke took Wheeler to flank left, while Tony, Weasel, and Tech moved right. They approached from the tall grass, stopping just at the edge. The 2 men outside seemed to be having a discussion which might take some time. They would not be able to enter through the front without being spotted. It's not like it's going to matter anyway, one of the men said. What do you mean? The other replied. You know we're all going to be speaking Spanish soon, the first retorted. Ah, that's just rumor. The Mexicans aren't going to come all the way up here, his friend said. Either way, I'm going to have as much fun as I can before then, the first said with a laugh. Tony had no idea what they meant, but he made a note to ask the general when they returned. He looked across the field to Duke, who was signaling for him to take his group around back to find an entrance. Motioned with his hand a confirmation, then pointed to his right. The group followed behind him closely with their weapons at the ready. They moved in a staggered formation, slipping through the brush until they reached the backyard. The grass had not been kept cut, which allowed them to draw closer to the rear entrance. The steps were broken, and the door appeared to be boarded shut. They would not be able to enter without making a lot of noise. Weasel tapped Tony on the shoulder and pointed to 2 large doors that led downward. They could only assume it led to some sort of cellar, which would be their best bet. Tech fished for his lock-picking set and started work on the fastened chain that held the doors closed. The boys eased the doors open, deafening the creak the old wood would make. They entered one at a time, descending into darkness. Their feet met concrete steps that dropped below floor level toward a dirt floor. Each flashlight attached to their rifles flickered to life, and they took the room in sweeping formation. The interior was only half that of the upper floors, surrounded by a cinder block foundation. Wooden shelves lined the room with glass jars of varying size. Weasel approached, his light refracting through the liquid inside. It revealed a fleshy mass that had once been a human foot, floating in some sort of preservative. Weasel's eyes widened once he realized what was in front of him, and when Tony noticed this, he clasped his hand over the boy's mouth. Tony shook his head and raised a finger to his mouth. They could not afford to be heard before they knew what was waiting upstairs. Tony radioed the rest of the group to inform them that his group had made it inside. After receiving confirmation, the group continued to search the room for an entry into the home. Among the jars were various body parts, but what was most disturbing was the intact body of a fetus. Tony stared at this particular specimen for several minutes, unable to understand why anyone would do this. Tech's flashlight waved side to side to draw their attention to a ladder. The rungs ended at a hatch in the ceiling. Tony motioned for his squad mate to go up, then pointed to his eyes to give an order to look around. Tech slid his rifle over his shoulder and started to ascend. Once he reached the hatch, he gave it a slight push. To his surprise, it moved, so he reached into his pocket to reveal a small mirror. The hatch raised slightly, and with the mirror he circled the space. It appeared to exit into a pantry full of more jars, so he finished opening the hatch. Once Tech gave the all clear, the other two joined him in the cramped pantry. Tony took the mirror and slid it under the edge of the pantry door. The other side held a kitchen with a large butcher block table in the center. The wood was still stained from the last use, which caused Tony's dinner to try to exit his throat. He held it back and swallowed, gagging at the taste. He relayed what he saw to prepare his group for what they would see next, as he reached for the handle. Tony allowed the door to part just enough to see out, and noticed the hallway that led to the living room. The door swung open slowly, Tony's rifle rising as he exited. Weasel followed just behind, scanning the area to the rear of Tony. Tech was last, pushing the door back behind him and crossing the kitchen. Various cutting tools had been scattered across the kitchen counter, and the sink was still specked with blood and viscera. Tech covered his mouth and nose to try to block out the odor, but it was too powerful. The kitchen was tiny, and the back door was all that lay behind them. They had but one direction to go, and that was toward the living room. Each area was dimly lit with candles and oil lanterns, and the light danced along the walls. This only added to the sense of paranoia that grew in the young soldiers. They knew that at any corner, they could be met with a fight. Tony held up his hand to signal the group to stop as he approached a doorway to his left. All of them could hear the men in the living room talking now, but they had to check each room as they passed. The leader's rifle made the corner of the door, with Weasel just behind. It had once been a bedroom, but now resembled a torture chamber. The bed had been fitted with chains that currently held the lifeless body of a young woman. Tony checked her pulse to verify what his mind already knew to be true. He pulled the sheet over her cold and naked body. It was the best he could do for her now. They exited back into the hall and switched to the opposite wall in order to approach the next doorway. The passage was shut, so again Tony used the mirror to judge what may be on the other side. When he stood, he could only look back and shake his head. His hand grasped the knob carefully, turning it as slowly as possible. The light from the hall spilled into a tiny closet where another woman sat bound and gagged within. The woman's eyes grew wide and began shaking at the sight of the boys. Tony could only imagine she thought they were there to hurt her. Tony whispered, "We are not here to hurt you. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" The woman nodded as if she understood, tears filling her eyes as Tony helped her to her feet. He ordered Weasel to escort her back to the cellar and away from the house. Weasel took the woman by the hand and headed back to the pantry door. Tony whispered into his radio for assistance. Duke responded, and once he was aware of the situation, he took Weasel's place in the group. They stood silent in the hall. The stairs leading up were to their left, and the doorway to the living room was right ahead. They could not risk alerting the men in the living room, but had no idea what lay in store above them. Tony pointed to the living room and moved forward, then pointed to Duke before gesturing toward his eyes and back up to the stairs. Duke nodded and aimed his rifle to the staircase. He fell to the back of the group to watch their back. Tony's rifle passed into the living room first, with Tech's shoulder at his back. Once he could see the two men within, he noticed they were playing cards at a small folding table and drinking beer. Their angle made it easier for their entry without being noticed at first, but once both of the boys were in the room, it was hard to hide. The men had weapons near them, but Tony and Tech were locked on their position. "Get up slowly. Do not speak," Tony whispered. The two men rose slowly, their hands coming up and over their heads. Tony gestured toward the front door, and the men began moving toward it. Tony tilted his head to key the radio in an attempt to inform Wheeler that two men would be exited in a minute. As he did, the man in the rear dove for Tony's rifle, shoving it against the wall. The boy instinctively fired, but the bullet buried into wood. He felt the man's fist punch him in the face as his body was shoved back into Tech. Tech could not shoot without harming Tony and simply stumbled back. By this time, Duke had turned his attention to his friends and attempted to get a clear shot. Tony struggled with his adversary as the other man ran for the shotgun that rested by the table. Feet bound down the stairs, questioning the noise. Duke turned to shoot, but was tackled to the ground by the man who had come down. One of the man's hands pressed the rifle into Duke's chest, while the other drove its knuckles into his face. Tony was finally able to bring his knee up and push back the one that held him. His rifle snapped into place, and 3 shots were fired before the man could regain his balance. As that one dropped, Tony turned to the next, who was about to fire the shotgun. The boy pulled the trigger while dropping backward into the hall. The door frame was splintered by 5.56 rounds and buckshot simultaneously as Tony hit the floor. Duke blocked the next few punches with the butt of his rifle and attempted to shove the man off of him, but it was no use. He was too large. The body of his rifle began to bury into his neck, cutting off his air until Tech turned and dropped the end of his gun into the man's temple. The large figure crumpled to the floor, holding his head and cursing. Tony looked back as the man attempted to get up and screamed for Tech to shoot. His friend simply stared with his gun trained on the person. "Damn it, I said shoot," Tony yelled. At the sound of gunfire and screaming, Wheeler and Weasel forced their way in the front door. Weasel popped a couple of rounds into the man in the living room who was injured but trying to get up from the floor. The man's body dropped limp after one bullet pierced his skull. Wheeler shoved Tech aside and fired 3 rounds at the final adversary, 2 hitting him in the chest and 1 in the neck. Blood sprayed across the hall and created a peppered painting on the wall. "You guys okay?" Weasel asked. "We're fine," Tony said while gasping for air. "You get the girl out?" "Yes, sir. She's with Overwatch," Wheeler replied. "Good. Let's finish sweeping this house and get the hell out of here," Tony replied. Duke nodded while as he adjusted his gear again, preparing to ascend the steps. They fell in line behind him, Tony taking up the rear. If there was anyone else inside, they would have to face all of them. When they reached the top step, they were greeted by several young children. They stood whimpering in doorways of bedrooms and staring at the stairway. The boys approached slowly, asking if there were any other adults inside. Some shook their head and others simply stared blankly, while the group searched each room. After a short interview of some of the oldest children, the group learned that each one had been abducted, along with their parents, and had not seen either of them for weeks. Night Stalker 1 to Overwatch, Tony spoke into his radio transmitter. This is Overwatch. Go ahead, Night Stalker 1, the voice replied. Mission complete. We have 12 civilian miners that will need extraction. Tony's voice sounding far older than it was. 10 Night Stalker 1, extraction en route in 15. The voice came again. The ride back to base was a quiet one. The group was bruised, but not nearly as bad as the children they accompanied. Tony had felt bad about their near failure, but when he saw how much worse his life could have been, he let the feeling fade. This was the world he was part of now, and at least he was on the right side of it. The children hugged each other and questioned their destination. Some of the other Night Stalkers attempted to explain the base, but Duke suggested they limit their information until they could speak to the general. Tony let their words fade away as he stared at the farmhouse ablaze. They had burned all evidence of the carnage in hopes to deter anyone else from repeating it. He had seen so much death in such a short period of time. His body felt numb as the light danced in the distance. Everything continued to burn, even though the fall was over. He wondered if this was what life would be from here on out, death and destruction. He used to like fire, the beauty of it, but that was when it was for roasting marshmallows. His hands gripped his rifle a little tighter in anger, as he was reminded of another thing he may never do again. Once again, Tony found himself sitting in Foreman's office for debriefing. The small glimmer of light was gone from his eyes now. It faded in the distance with that burning farmhouse. The general spoke, but the sound was muffled by Tony's thoughts. He answered robotically, giving any pertinent information. When the meeting came to a close, Foreman asked if the boy would be all right. Tony simply nodded and stood from his seat. He headed for the door, but just as he reached for the knob, he remembered something. "A question, sir." Tony turned back to the general. "Go ahead, Stone," Foreman responded. "Is there an army marching on North America?" the boy questioned. The general paused and closed the file he had been scribbling in. "Yes," he sighed. "That's why you need the kids, right?" Tony pressed harder. Foreman rubbed at his eyes. "We need everyone we can find. We're severely outnumbered." Tony opened the door. "Then I should get back to my men. We have training to do." When Tony entered the barracks, the rest of his group were breaking down their gear and preparing to head to bed. He stood in the doorway watching each of them, their faces showing defeat. He knew that if a few locals almost took them down, there was no way these boys could survive war. This could not be the end, he thought. He had just found Colin's brother and friends. Tony stood silently watching each of them move about the room and imagined their death. This world had too much of that already. "Stop unpacking," Tony finally spoke. Duke looked up. "We're not going back out, are we?" Tony nodded and listened as the group groaned in unison. "We're leaving," Tony said. He drew them in close and told them about the conversation he had overheard during their mission and Foreman's confirmation of the rumor. Each of them listened intently, and Tony could see the fear in their eyes. None of them were older than 17 and knew they were not prepared to face battle-hardened soldiers. Tony urged them to pack as much supplies as possible over the next 24 hours and to meet at the motor pool at sunset. They would commandeer a vehicle and leave this place. The apex predators would have to fight this war without them. Tony had made a promise to survive, and he would protect his new family, especially Duke. The following day were spent gathering food, weapons, and ammunition. They were not sure how long they would be on the road, but several packs were prepped for their last mission. Wheeler had acquired the key to the motor pool under the pretense of gassing up with one of the Humvees. Weasel distracted Pack Rat long enough for Weasel to gather the items they would need. Tech had always helped in the kitchen, so it was not odd when he requested access to the pantry. One by one they acquired the supplies they would need, and by the time the sun had fallen, they had all met at the motor pool. Duke and Tech loaded gear into a Humvee as Tony and Weasel plotted a course. The weather north was too harsh, and there would be enemy forces to the south. They had to be careful no matter their choice, but it had to be made now. Wheeler climbed into the driver's seat as the rest took their places inside. Tony climbed into the passenger seat and pointed at a destination on the northeast coast as the vehicle roared to life. The group approached the gate where a guard questioned their actions. Tony leaned over and gave an excuse of having a secret mission. The guard was not convinced and radioed for confirmation. Tony simply nodded, and Wheeler hit the gas, barreling through the barricade and into the night, gunfire peppering the vehicle in their retreat. Duke leaned forward. "So what's the plan?" "We're going to get as far away from here as possible and hopefully stay alive," Tony replied. Duke leaned back and the vehicle fell quiet. None of them were sure where to go or how they would be able to sustain themselves in this world. The apex predators would surely be looking for them, and they would have to avoid the army that was taking control of North America. All of this only made surviving more difficult, but they had each other, and that would have to be enough. As they passed the remains of the old farmhouse, their eyes fell on the smoldering wreckage. Smoke still tainted the air above it, and they wondered if that could be their future. Headlights of 3 vehicles topped a hill behind them, and they instantly knew it would be the predators. Their vehicle began receiving bullets within seconds, and each of them ducked to avoid any ricochet. Wheeler forced accelerator down further until it touched the floor. He struggled to remain on the road as their pursuers drew closer. Weasel grabbed his rifle and leaned from the window, returning fire. Tony screamed for him to get inside, but it was too late. The boy was shot 4 times in the chest. The rifle tumbled from the vehicle and his body fell limp in the seat, his head still hanging out the window. "No one else try to be a hero," Tony yelled as Tech scrambled to cover Weasel's wounds. "It's too late, he's gone, man," Duke said as he pulled at Tech's arm. "They're gaining on us, Stone," Wheeler yelled. Tony looked back, and the lead vehicle was only 2 car lengths away. They would overtake them, and more than likely kill them. He had to do something and fast, so he told Wheeler to head for the trees. The wheels kicked up dirt as they rapidly changed direction. The boys were tossed about inside as they bound over a hill and into the woods. The 2 Humvees behind them followed after and weaved between trees. Wheeler struggled to avoid each one as well, but sideswiped a large oak, causing him to lose control. The wheels caught at an awkward angle and turned the vehicle on its side. The world went dark for a moment, and when Tony opened his eyes, he could have sworn he saw Colin kneeling over him. He smiled slightly, and Colin did the same. He could hear talking around him, but he simply looked back to his old friend. Tony began to apologize, but Colin simply shook his head. The figure mouthed the words, "You're not done yet," before disappearing. Tony was forced back to reality by the sound of Tech screaming for help. General Foreman had him by the hair and was dragging him toward one of the other vehicles. Duke struggled to remove himself from the overturned Humvee, and it appeared that Wheeler had been killed during the crash. Tony slowly rose from the ground, his eyes searching the area. Duke was almost free from the vehicle, and Foreman had returned to claim another one of the boys. The other Humvee had turned back once they noticed the crash. They would need equipment to retrieve the vehicle, and Foreman was sure he could handle a couple of kids. Tony grit his teeth and began walking toward the general, despite the pain he now felt in his knee. His hand reached down and grasped a grenade, pulling the pin. He shoved it out in front of him so Foreman could clearly see. "You step away from that Humvee," Tony screamed. "We are taking it and we are getting out of here." Foreman paused and held up his hands. "Now hold on. Let's don't do anything stupid." No talking," Tony barked. "You get away from the vehicle now, or we all die." The general laughed. "You can't be serious, kid." "Dead serious. We are leaving, and you are not going to follow us," Tony replied. "We don't want to be pawns in your war. We are not soldiers. We are kids, and we are going to live." Foreman slowly backed away as Duke grabbed a few bags from the crashed vehicle. The two boys joined Tech in the general's vehicle, and Duke took the driver's seat. Tony eased himself into the passenger seat, still holding the live grenade. As they rolled past the crash, Tony tossed the explosive into the crashed Humvee. Foreman dove behind a tree as the three boys drove away. The sound of the explosion echoed through the trees as they exited the woods. They never looked back as they headed east and toward anything better than the life they had come to know.